You know how a business can look successful and still die because cash stops moving. It can have a beautiful office, employees, branding, even profit on paper. But if cash does not return at the right time, the whole thing starts choking. That is the part of capitalism people understand very quickly because money has no patience for your narrative. You can say your company is visionary, disruptive, community-driven, spiritually aligned, whatever word is fashionable this quarter, but payroll still arrives with the emotional subtlety of a brick. This is why cash flow is not just an accounting term. Cash flow is the bloodstream of capitalism. When cash stops moving, the whole system starts to freeze. When cash comes back, capital can keep growing and repeating itself. Marx has this brutal line in Capital: money ends the movement only to begin it again. And that is exactly the structure I'm translating. Money does not move because it is bored. It moves because capitalism only feels alive when value returns larger than before. Now, here is the concept I want to coin under a specific definition. I call it sex flow. By sex flow, I do not mean sex itself. I mean the circulation of desire, sexual tension, fantasy, validation, charm, emotional lag, and intimacy under capitalism. Cash flow is what keeps the economy breathing, and sex flow is what keeps the modern person emotionally in motion. That is the whole argument of this video. And before someone pretends to be very rational in the comments, no, I'm not saying sex is evil. I'm saying modern life has learned how to turn desire into circulation. That is much more interesting than moral panic. Moral panic reduces the whole issue to people are having too much sex. Lullaby philosophy tells us that everyone is simply discovering who they are. Both are too stupid to explain the machine. The real question is not whether people are having too much sex, less sex, casual sex, spiritual one, toxic one, liberated one, or whatever language our generation uses to avoid silence. The real question is why desire must keep returning to the market. Think about the feeling after you get the thing you wanted. Someone finally replies to your match. You feel that someone actually wants you. For a moment, the fantasy feels real. You feel chosen, powerful, desirable, or simply less invisible. But then the feeling starts to fade. And the fact that it fades is exactly why the system keeps going. It just resets and starts again. That is sex flow. I'm not talking about sex as some sacred bond or reducing sex to biological pleasure either. I'm also not talking about the rare moment when two people truly meet each other. Sex flow is sex, desire, fantasy, and validation transformed into a repeatable circuit. Cash flow asks one brutal question: did cash return? And sex flow asks a quieter question: did desire return? Or did the fantasy come back again? Did the want turn into pleasure just long enough for you to avoid truly metabolizing it? This is where modern people become very defensive. They usually say, I'm just making my own choices. Perhaps, but a person who is truly free does not need to defend every installed desire as if it were sacred personal discovery. A lot of modern freedom is just obedience that learned to use first-person language. Nobody has to command you if they can chain your hunger. The cage does not need walls if you can make people laugh at the door. This is how the zombie worldview works. It does not even have to say that the soul is fake or to start an argument. It simply makes deeper questions feel embarrassing before people even get a chance to think about them. Say Tao, soul, prayer, sacred love, masculine shadow, feminine shadow, and watch the modern educated face do that tiny little smile. That is not an actual argument, but the vibe of it already dismisses everything better than an argument. It is just status protection dressed up as intelligence. This matters because the same protects sex flow. When you ask whether their desires were shaped for them, they think you are being moralistic. Then you ask whether sex has become part of a system. They think it's repression. In the end, you ask whether fantasy is covering a wound. They think you are judgmental. So they never answer the question. They just protect the operating system inside their own mind. Now, let me make the cash flow parallel very simple. Cash flow means money keeps moving, so the system can survive, grow, and repeat itself. So does sex flow. It is basically like desire keeps moving through a person, so they can manage anxiety, feel wanted, and stay inside the game. Cash flow turns work, products, and sales into money that comes back, while sex flow turns loneliness, image, pursuit, and validation into desire that keeps coming back. The cash circuit is very simple. money becomes a commodity, then comes back as more money. In sex flow, sex becomes a solution, lack gets validation, and then becomes lack again. Pay attention to the last part. The return of lack is not where the system fails. The return of lack is exactly how the system gets you to repeat the cycle. Madame Marx would say desire ends the encounter only to begin the hunger again. That is not a real Marx quote. That is my sex flow translation of his cash flow logic. And it is more useful than simply quoting another philosopher about sex because it shows the machine changing costumes. Aristotle saw another side of the problem much earlier. In politics, he says there is no bound to the riches produced by this kind of wealth getting. In other words, money was supposed to serve life, but it can become motion serving only more motion. Madame Aristotle would say, desire without form becomes appetite without home. Again, not a quote, a translation. Because sex flow is what happens when desire loses form and becomes useful to circulation. This is why stability becomes suspicious in modern life. A person with instability is bad for business. A stable relationship makes people less dependent on the market. Someone who is not always worried about being desirable is much harder to sell things to. Someone who can sit with loneliness without instantly turning it into stimulation becomes difficult to control, not because they hate sex, because they are no longer easy to keep moving through the system. This is also why the modern world sells fake freedom so well, but it rarely asks where those wants came from. It tells you you can become anyone, but quietly it pushes everyone to compete for the same kinds of attention. Then it says you are free now. But that freedom often means constantly optimizing your body, your profile, your face, vibe, emotional usefulness, and your sexual appeal. In Chinese internet language, people talk about emotional these days as emotional value. That phrase is revealing because even your ability to comfort, excite, validate, and emotionally regulate someone becomes value. So the modern person does not only ask, am I useful? They ask, am I desirable enough to be emotionally chosen? That is market learning how to speak through intimacy. I know this sounds offensive, it should. Not because the point is to hate modern people. The point is to stop worshipping every modern instinct, as if it came from pure personal freedom. These days, people demand proof all the time, but never demand proof that their desires are actually their own. That is educated shallowness. They can explain the brain chemistry of attraction and still miss the architecture of longing. Now, when cash flow breaks, a business has to face material reality. Similarly, if sex flow does not work, a person has to face emotional reality. When the money does not come back, the company has to find out what was fake. Now, if that sex solution does not come back, the person has to find out what was empty. That is why people fear stillness. Stillness is the place where the fantasy finally stops working. The person has to ask whether the hunger was ever really about sex at all. Maybe the hunger was never really about sex. Perhaps it was about wanting to feel seen, wanting to feel powerful, wanting to know you were not disposable, or trying to keep a small want alive because modern life never gave it the space to heal. That is sex flow. The circulation of desire so the want keeps moving instead of becoming wisdom. So when I say sex flow runs the subject, I'm not saying sex controls everything. I'm saying capitalism does not only need your labor, it also needs your longing to keep moving, your fantasies to keep coming back, and your loneliness to enter the market before it has the chance to become a deeper question about your life. Because the moment desire stops circulating, something older can happen. I'm not talking about repression, purity theater, or fake traditional morality from people who secretly worship the same market. I mean something quieter than all of that. A question. Maybe desire was never supposed to keep running endlessly. Perhaps desire was supposed to take shape instead. Or sex was not meant to keep managing emotional lack, but to show where the soul has been split. That is where this series is going. The first episode is only the definition. Cash flow keeps the economy alive. Sex flow keeps the modern person moving through the system. And the modern society that can circulate your desire does not need to own your body directly. It only needs to make your hunger feel like freedom.